Hi there everyone, welcome to week 5's first video. In this video we're going to be discussing what I call Spinoza's radical rationalism. So we're going to give a brief overview of Spinoza's thought, why Spinoza is considered an important philosopher, and in particular for this video we're going to focus on his philosophical differences from Descartes. And as we're going to see and examine in much more detail over the next couple of weeks, many features of Spinoza's philosophy grate against the religious beliefs at the time. And so Spinoza was for centuries actually regarded as an atheistic philosopher. He was seen as an enemy of, dominant religious faith. He was actually Jewish, not Christian, but he was excommunicated from his Jewish community. There was a Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam, during the 17th century. And just to give you a little taste of how pissed off they were essentially by Spinoza, I just want to read a little brief segment of the text of Spinoza's excommunication. So this happened July 27th in 1656. He was previously a part of this Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam. Amsterdam was known as like one of the most tolerant places in all of Europe, right, for religious differences. But even here, Spinoza was in very much hot water, as we will see. Okay, so I'm going to read a little selection of this. So this is starting from the beginning. They say the lords of the Ma'amid, i.e. the governing body of the six Parnassim and the Gabai, announced that having long known the evil opinions and acts of Baruch de Spinoza, they have endeavored by various means and promises to turn him from his evil ways. But having failed to make him mend his wicked ways, and on the contrary, daily receiving more and more serious information about the abominable heresies which he practiced and taught, about his monstrous deeds, and having for this numerous trustworthy witnesses who have deposed and borne witness to this effect in the presence of said Spinoza, they became convinced of the truth of this matter. And after all of this has been investigated, the presence of the Honorable Hakahim, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, I'm pretty sure I'm not, they decided with their consent that the said Spinoza should be excommunicated and expelled from the people of Israel. Reading a little bit further. By decree of the angels and by the command of the holy men, we excommunicate, expel, curse, and damn Baruch de Spinoza with the consent of God, blessed be he, and with the consent of the entire holy congregation in front of these holy scrolls, with the 613 precepts which are written therein, cursing him with the excommunication with which Joshua banned Jericho, and with the curse which Elisha cursed the boys, and all the castigations which are written in the book of law. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he comes in. The Lord will not spare him, but then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against that man, and all the curses that are written in this book shall lie upon him, and the Lord shall blot out his name from under heaven. And the Lord shall separate him unto evil out of all the tribes of Israel, according to all the curses in the covenant that are written in the book of law. So, very, very serious stuff, It was not very common at all for philosophers of this period to be excommunicated from religious authorities, although we did mention in the first day that a philosopher that Spinoza admired, actually, Giordano Bruno, was himself burned in the year 1600 for heresies. So, we can say simply from that Spinoza's thought, he's quite a firecracker, right? He really gets under the skin of people that, hold orthodox beliefs. And, really what we're going to spend a lot of time today on is why. Why does Spinoza in particular, really bother, these religious authorities? And just to provide you another example of that, one of the readings that I assigned you this week was Pierre Bayle. And in particular, really, I just wanted you to capture his description of Spinoza, right? It's very much similar to what I read here in terms of, calling Spinoza an atheist, saying that he is irreligious and professing his irreligion, right? And so on and so forth, right? Bayle at least says, Spinoza seems like a good person, even though he was promoting such heinous beliefs or whatever, right? But the point is just to show that this was the general reaction that both religious authorities at the time, but also other philosophers had whenever they originally encountered Spinoza. That Spinoza is someone who is at his core a fundamental challenge to traditional religious belief, right? And so in that way, Spinoza has been associated with a kind of atheism, although that's something that we're going to be interrogating over the next few weeks. Because even though Spinoza is frequently called an atheist, right? He claims that the highest value of human existence is the intellectual love of God. Right? That doesn't really sound like any atheist that I had known previously, right? But what we're going to see is that Spinoza's conception of God is so radically different from Descartes, as well as, other sort of traditional theologians and so on at the time, that they thought that he might as well be an atheist, right? Even if he says all this stuff about God, right? We shouldn't really take that seriously, and we should instead see it for what it is, which is ultimately a kind of atheism. Now, one of the ways that Spinoza announces for these figures his atheism is he says at one point, I should have probably written this down, Deus sive natura. Sorry, it seems like my camera's a little... Okay, Deus sive natura. So let's write this down. So, I'll just move over here. I wrote it at the bottom here, and we're going to get started with the rest of the word here in just a minute. Deus sive natura. What that means is God or nature. What does that mean? It means that Spinoza thought that it was indifferent whether you thought about God as calling it God, or you just called it nature, right? And so God is not like the traditional sort of monotheistic idea of God, where God is a person, God is in fact the best person, and God sits up in heaven and makes judgments about people, about who's good and who's bad, and so on, and is sort of this judge, right? God judges finite creatures, himself being, the best, right? And that's what gives us our traditional ideas about the soul and heaven and hell, right? What Spinoza says is that the essence of God that God's fundamental nature is fundamentally incompatible with this conception of God. For Spinoza, God is not a person. God does not make decisions. God is instead, in his view, the ultimate substance of the world, right? And so one way that you might try to begin to get a picture of it, right? Even though we still definitely need to work out this idea in a lot more detail, is that God is like an ocean under which all the individual creatures in the world, or all events in the world itself, you might think of as just waves, right? They are individual, they are different, right? But they all ultimately rely on an underlying substance, right? If you want to know about the waves, you should know about the deeper body of water, right? The ocean that's generating the waves, or the lake, or whatever, right? And this is going to be, for Spinoza, the way that he thinks about substances. For Spinoza, there are no substances. There are no finite substances, excuse me. There's only one substance. It's the absolute substance. That substance is God, and God is the basis or foundation of all of the individual things, right? In the same way that we thought about substance in Descartes as the bearer of properties, right? Spinoza, and this is a radical and kind of in some ways nutty, right, idea, similar in some ways to Cavendish that we saw last week, is that everything in the universe, right, are all modifications of a single substance. And whether or not you call that substance God or nature is indifferent, right? And so Spinoza's conception of God, and this is something that we will spend the next few weeks elaborating in far more detail, but Spinoza's conception of God is more like God is the eternal laws of the universe, or something like that, right? God's not a person. God's not like us pulling the strings. God just describes the necessary order of things, right? He leaves out all of this stuff that he thought was purely mythological. In his own lifetime, he published a book called The Theological Political Treatise. And we're not going to read that because it's quite long, and it also is about interpreting the Bible, right? And what Spinoza did in this book that made people very angry and very uncomfortable is he said something which I think to most readers will strike them as obviously true, which is that if the Bible or if holy books contain truth, that they do so through allegory, metaphor, right, so on and so forth, storytelling devices that are not themselves strictly rational, right? It's a way of conveying the point, but a way of conveying it that risks in some ways losing or simplifying too much, right? Spinoza had this idea that, like, the holy books reveal some kinds of wisdom, right? But they're more worldly wisdom, right? It's not the divine immediate revelation of God, right? And so in that way, he's attacking the status of these holy books to be able to give us direct insight into the nature of God. For Spinoza, as we shall see, only reason can know God, because God's essence is itself rational, right? And if God's essence is rational, then it follows that it must be rationally explicable. And so if you want to cultivate and develop an intellectual love of God, then that doesn't mean studying holy books, knowing the dates or whatever out of whatever holy text, being able to identify quotations, being able to perform certain church rituals. and so on. For Spinoza, to the contrary, intellectual love of God comes from science and philosophy. Science, because science reveals that the world is well ordered, right? Science reveals that the movements of the planets are not haphazard and random, but follow a mathematical paradigm that you can know and understand and use to predict events in the world. And the more that you come to understand the rational order created by God, the more you can identify yourself within it, right? And so Spinoza thought, and this was a thought that was central to his thinking, is that the intellectual love of God brings joy, right? You can avoid all of these negative religious feelings that he effectively feels that religions use to blackmail you into belief, right? Now, love of God is not about avoiding hell or making up for original sin or something like that, but of increasing your joy and power and appreciation for the order of nature, right? And thereby being able to make more sense of your own place within it. And so that's to say a little bit about Spinoza's biography, his general sort of like picture of the world, which we will have to elaborate in much more detail, and how he was generally kind of received. So now let's start actually going through the work, right? Up top we have Spinoza's radical rationalism, and in this left-hand column I've divided up into two sections, right? Two words that I have not introduced so far, and then actually do not come up in your reading. These are words used by more contemporary philosophers, not by the philosophers of the period, but these terms provide very useful descriptions. We want to try to really sink into the difference between Spinoza and Descartes. And in part, what we want to discover is, why was Descartes acceptable and Spinoza is not, right? There are lots of reasons that we can imagine right off the bat, but what I'm going to try to say is that these two terms provide something like an answer to that question, right? So univocity, equivocity, what is this about? Well, they are two different standpoints on the ability of human beings to know the fundamental substance of reality, right? So what is vocity? Vocity is just voice, right? And uni means one, and equi means many, right? Or equal, right? And so to get a hold of this idea, let's try to recall what Descartes said about substance in the Principles of Philosophy. There, Descartes drew a distinction between absolute and finite substances. So the only thing that truly qualifies as an absolute substance for Descartes is God, right? Because God is not dependent on creation whatsoever, right? God chooses what is created, right? Creation follows from God, right? And so therefore, creation is dependent on God. God is not dependent on creation. So when we think about using substance in the absolute sense that belongs to it, then we think about God, right? But if we think about substance in terms of finite substances, the individual things in our universe, staplers and pens and so on, right? Then we have to use substance in a different way, right? We still mean that it exhibits a kind of independence, but it's a relative kind of independence, right? Like the properties exhibited by this pink stapler are relatively independent, right? They belong to the stapler, they don't belong to other things. The stapler would be relatively hard to destroy, so on, right? And so what Descartes says is we equivocate, right? We use the same word in multiple senses whenever we talk about the nature of God or we talk about the nature of finite substances. And for Descartes, this is related to his skepticism, right? Descartes believes fundamentally that we have to occupy a human perspective, right? This is why the Meditations begins with the cogito argument instead of beginning with proofs for God. Because Descartes thinks that the human standpoint is immediately available to us, right? Whereas the standpoint of God is something that we can only reach through rational inquiry, through inferences, right? And in particular, by analogy, right? So, like, how do we conceive of God? Well, we think about God as embodying the pinnacle of perfection, right? And so we take the perfections that we can identify in finite things, right? The relative stability and independence of this pen, right? And then we just expand it to infinity, right? And then we can understand what God is like, right? That's kind of the general thinking and idea. The way that we come to relate the finite and the absolute is especially through analogy, right? It's by equivocating. We can never directly access the nature of absolute substance. We're confined always, essentially, to a human perspective for Descartes, right? And so this is his equivocity, that, the fundamental constituents of the universe, substance, we have to use in two different ways, right? And for those of you who have taken ancient Greek philosophy, this was something that Aristotle originally said. He says in his Metaphysics that, or I think it's the Metaphysics, that being is said in many ways, right? And the point of his analysis is like, well, we can't discover the ultimate constituents of reality. We can't sort of embody this God's eye perspective where we can see everything at the same time as one unity, right? We have to embody this imperfect human perspective, right? Where we sort of indirectly come to know the nature of being. By contrast, what Spinoza does is Spinoza refuses this move in Descartes. Spinoza says the substance has one meaning, the meaning that Descartes attributes to absolute substance, and insists that Descartes be consistent with his vocabulary, right? And if we are consistent with Descartes' vocabulary and we insist on not equivocating, right, and modes are contingent qualities, right, then all of the individual things that exist in the universe are simply modes. They're simply contingent things, right? Versus the one necessary absolute substance. And so, importantly, let's talk about the political ramifications of this move, right? What this distinction allowed Descartes to do is it let him find the proper balance, the proper distinction between reason and faith, right? Philosophy can tell you about our own worldly existence, but it cannot tell you directly about the absolute nature of God, right? Or at least it can only tell you certain features about that God, right? Philosophy does not on its own resolve, what sort of religious sect that you should join, right? Only the text of Revelation can do that, and that is part of what Descartes was doing in the dedicatory letter to the Sorbonne, as he was saying to the church, hey, I'm not impinging on your territory. I'm not trying to replace Revelation. I'm only trying to supplement it with the power of philosophy. And so the ability to navigate that distinction, he has to say, okay, I can figure out stuff about this, and you can provide us all the information that you'd like about absolute substance. So this was Descartes' compromise, in some ways, right? You can think about it as being very much related to his dualism, right? We have a dualism between two different kinds of finite substances, but we also have this dualism between absolute and finite substance. And Spinoza, importantly, rejects this idea. And essentially, we can think about Spinoza's complaint about Descartes as going like this, moving on to the other column of the board. If Descartes' thesis is true, that we may never know the essence of God except through analogy with the finite, this should say then instead of but, then analogy is imaginative, not rational, right? What does Spinoza mean? Spinoza means that whenever you try to discover features about the absolute nature of reality by making an analogy with your own point of view, then you are extremely susceptible to prejudices, right? And what is one prejudice? Well, Spinoza identifies as a prejudice that we imagine that God will represent us as human beings, right? And so insofar as we think about human beings as being distinctly rational, using language, we judge others, and so on, we think about ourselves as good and we want to think about the world as made for us, then we will always think about God this way, right? And for Spinoza, if we're guided by these kinds of prejudices, right, guided by sort of only what we can imagine God to be like, not what we can really know God to be like, then we're not truly rationalist, right? We're not really discovering the essence of the universe from foundational rational principles. And we should consider it an offense for someone to say that, God resembles them in particular, right? Why would it? There's no rational reason for believing that. There are only prejudicial reasons for believing that. It would be good for us if God resembled us, right? And so it's a kind of wishful thinking that we imagine is rational in some ways, but just clearly, if we think about this scheme, cannot be rational, right? And so Spinoza concludes, we must correct Descartes by revealing the absolute essence of God through pure reason alone. No more revelation. Revelation does not tell you anything essential or important about God's nature for Spinoza. The only things that follow from God's nature are things that are available to everyone, right? It's not the ownership of the church. It's not owned by particular religious sects that own certain documents and so on, right? You want to know about God? Know about the world, right? That's sort of what Spinoza believes. And that is a profound challenge. And here you can think about Spinoza as being a radical rationalist, right? Descartes was a rationalist. He believed that the fundamental truths that we can discover about the universe are rational. But he was also kind of a skeptical rationalist, right? He thought that there were certain essential limitations to a human perspective. So there are things that we can discover purely rationally, but they are quite limited, right? And they cannot allow us direct internal insight into the essence of God. So there are fundamental limitations. By contrast, for Spinoza is a radical rationalist because he believes that you can discover the essential, you can actually discover, all of the essential qualities of God or of the substance of reality. All you need is reason, right? And this was an extremely profound challenge for religious authorities at the time, and that makes it easy to see why Spinoza was conceived of as an atheist and as someone who's vitally important to this new liberal movement that is sort of beginning to sweep throughout Europe against old traditional religious authority. Okay, I hope that this video was helpful and that you've had a great day. Thanks, bye.